Greetings, my name is Chamomile and this is an examination of the entire galaxy sector by sector. Today we're looking at Tharin Sector and 12th Cerulean Spear Command, right on the northern edge of Hutt space. There's a bunch of prisons out here. The Empire had tons of prisons by the time they went mask off because they thought the Death Star would make them invincible, but the Republic had one out here too. Uvu 4 is where the late Republic kept its most dangerous criminals. Story is that Jango Fett broke a guy out of here for information on Komari Vosa and her Bando Gora once, and also that they hosted pod races here for some reason. The pod racing circuit was not entirely legal, so it's not surprising that it was super sketch, but, hosting an event where doing crimes mid-race is allowed and encouraged at a prison seems like a scheme by prison authorities to save on transportation costs. This sector is also allegedly home to Deles 4, a Rebel Alliance prison world. Not New Republic, Rebel Alliance, which speaks to the extent that the rebels were running a full-on nation-state in the Outer Rim after the Battle of Yavin. Despite having a famous prison out here, Tharin Sector also has Junkfort Station, a famous shadow port where smuggler, bounty hunters, and other ne'er-do-wells and seldom-do-wells gather to find shady jobs and make shady connections. Junkfort does a lot of illegal ship modifications. It can't service capital ships, but if you've got a Corvette that you want upgraded with military-grade turbo lasers that fell off the back of a truck, Junkfort's got you covered. There's a story that Han Solo went to Junkfort Station after the Battle of Yavin on behalf of the Rebel Alliance, looking for something called a power gem that could be used to build a weapon to destroy the Super Star Destroyer. Something vaguely like that might have happened, but the Rebel Alliance didn't generally go for super weapons the way the Empire did, and I'm positive that if this so-called power gem exists, it has a real name that's much less vague. The Tharin Sector was added into the Republic after the Fourth Pius Dea Crusade. You might remember the Third Crusade from Castellar Sector, and although we don't have many details about these crusades, and it's possible that the Third Crusade was a huge success, and by unfortunate coincidence all of its gains were completely undone by the time of the Sith Wars, the evidence suggests the Third Crusade was a miserable failure. On the other hand, the Fourth Crusade successfully pushed the Hutt Empire back from the Tion Cluster to the current modern boundaries of recognized Hutt space. Indeed, while the Hutt Empire still existed 30 crusades later, though note that the majority of the crusades between the 4th and the 34th did not target the Hutts, the Pius Dea era brought an end to the Hutt Empire as an imperialist conquering force and ushered in the transition to the modern Hutt cartels, using criminal networks and economic interests to expand past the recognized borders of Hutt space without making any formal claims or landing any official armies. Jabba the Hutt had enough enforcers on Tatooine to be the de facto ruler for about a century, but he never landed an army or officially overthrew the local government, so neither the Republic nor the Empire ever took it as an act of war, and that strategy of criminal influence over direct conquest is something the Hutts settled on after the Pius Dea conflicts, especially the Fourth Crusade, which went quite well for the Republic. Before the Fourth Crusade, the Hutts controlled what is now the Felim, Suol-Riep, and Tharin sectors, and even part of Jospro Sector. Suol-Riep and Tharin sectors have fallen back under Hutt influence at times, but it's weird to think of Jospro Sector as being anywhere near the Hutts' influence. It's mostly a flyover sector, but if you know about it, you probably think of it as being the border between the Tianese and the Republic, and it's kind of insane that the Hutts were up that far spinwards. Tharin Sector, on the other hand, is much more traditional Hutt territory, with a lot of planets that still show strong Hutt influence. It's the region of space from which the Hutts launched their attack on the Ash Worlds just before the Tianese War, between the Tian hegemony and the Republic, and it was the staging area for the Hutts' attack on Jospro Sector, where they bit off the outlying planets while the Republic was busy fighting the Tianese aristocracy. Alongside places like Castellar Sector, Suol-Riep Sector, and Hala Sector, it's a prime example of how the modern Hutt cartels often rule large chunks of their former territory that has nominally been ruled by the Republic or Empire since the early Republic era. Pius Dea pushed high human culture. It was still democratic. Unlike the Empire, there was never a point where the Senate got dissolved completely, and so they made a lot of room for good aliens, which mostly meant rich aliens from in or near the core worlds, like the Kamasi or Duros, ones with influence in the Senate. Outer Rim aliens could go fuck themselves, though, so when sectors like Tharin Sector got incorporated into the Republic, a bunch of species homeworlds got lumped together into one sector. Despite using the speciest, slave-owning evil of the Hutts as an example of the despicableness of alien cultures, something that is naturally repugnant to humans in our high human culture, the Pius Dea pretty much picked up the speciesism where the Hutts left off, cramming tons of aliens into Tharin Sector, which was rigged to minimize their political influence on the Senate, without giving them the option to become independent systems. Pius Dea dictated these aliens' future to them in basically the exact same way the Hutts did. And, in fairness, the democratic institutions and liberal expectations of the core worlds put limits on the level of overt exploitation and humiliation that the aliens of Tharin Sector could be subjected to compared to what the Hutts did. But still, the people who wouldn't shut up about high human culture were noticeably worse at actually upholding traditional core worlds values like the sector as a semi-sovereign cultural domain. So, what kind of aliens got shoved in here? The Rykos of planet Novor 23 and the Benishi of planet Benish have no physical description whatsoever, so as usual I suspect that these are actually terms for natives of these planets, regardless of species that have been misinterpreted as species names. The Tamarians of planet Tamar allegedly have air sacs that allow them to survive in vacuum for short periods of time. A lot of species have those, they're called lungs. Presumably the Tamarian air sacs are somehow vacuum sealed to prevent the air being sucked out of you and allow them to survive longer in space than the minute or two tops that humans can make it, but there's no other physical description of them, so I'm inclined to believe this is just a spacer tale or a misunderstanding. Nelidians are allegedly short brown humanoids from Nelid, a planet of desert mesas covered in swirling orange fog. This is about the only picture we have of them. It's not the craziest story, but sufficiently underdocumented that I give it 50-50 odds whether these guys are real. The Vathkree from the planet of the same name are allegedly rock people, like the Thing. This might just be a spacer tale, but, I mean, Vintians, so nothing's impossible. The Cedrians are supposedly a species of cool water centaur guys whose homeworld was entirely undiscovered because it was shielded from galactic explorers by a powerfully force-sensitive distributed intelligence in the planet's coral reefs, which the Cedrians call the Golden Sun and worship as a god. Supposedly, the Rebel Alliance discovered the planet and convinced the ruling High Priest of the Golden Sun to join the rebellion, thwarting an attempted coup by an isolationist faction, and the Cedrians are now a part of the New Republic as part of the Tharin Sector. Sounds like a spacer tale to me. Yes, there's an explanation for why this planet wasn't discovered until very late into history, and the explanation isn't so insane that I dismiss it out of hand, but I'm always skeptical of these stories that just so happen to take place during major, dramatic events that everyone knows about, like the Galactic Civil War or the Clone Wars. You'd expect more of these things where someone stumbles across a well-hidden world to occur at some random point in long eras of peace, like the High Republic or the parts of the Old Republic in lulls between Sith Wars, or at least to happen as the result of merchant spacers who outnumber rebels and Imperials both by a couple orders of magnitude. The Death Elves of planet Off-El are a canine species with the unique power to bend light around themselves, thus making them better at blending into shadows. That property has been replicated in a couple of armor technologies like Shadow Silk, and it generally comes with the trade-off that you can't build it into armor that's any good as actual armor, a trade-off that the Death Elves do not avoid, but you wouldn't expect their fur to be absorbing a whole lot of blaster bolts in the first place. Aphel is also a high-gravity world, which makes the Death Elf strong as hell, but also it's really expensive to get off their planet because regular repulsor lifts can't cancel enough gravity to just fly up into space like on most planets, so you have to use crazy launch catapults. I want to know what the hell is going on with this planet. The native species have somehow naturally evolved light-bending power on the bleeding edge of armor tech, the gravity well is deeper than a Tabana giant's, and yet the surface is still rocky enough to be able to walk around on. What the hell? The species in Tharin Sector you've heard of, though, are the Weequay of planet Srilur. Srilur is a desert planet prone to volcanic activity whose main liquid surface is acid seas. It's also an agri-world. Somehow the Weequay make that work. The Weequay have thousands of gods who are associated with physical forces like volcanoes, oceans, or the moon. That's not politically relevant to anything, I just think it's cool. The Weequay have been attacked by two other species from the Hutt sphere of influence, the Hooks from Swilrief Sector and the Nikto from inside Hutt space. The Hutts use these species conflicts to try and blackmail planets into submitting to them, promising to bring stability through brute force, freezing conflicts on terms guaranteed to breed long-term resentment between both parties in order to ensure that only the continuing domination of Hutt overlords can enforce peace between them. That way, anytime the Hutts are forced to recede back into their de jure borders by a resurgent republic, it leaves behind wars and calamities in their wake. In the specific case of Srilur, the Hook have extensive colonies on Srilur, and the Hutts use both economic incentive and brute force to keep them as separate from Weequay society as possible, while also forcing the Weequay to recognize borders that turn over sacred sites to Hook colonists, who absolutely do not care what god supposedly lives inside that mountain and will mine the shit out of it for even the cheapest ores. When the Hutts retreat, the war is inevitable. Unless, of course, the core worlds are feeling more militant than usual. The Hutt strategy of encouraging species wars that only brute force can contain might work pretty well against the Republic, that's trying to use economic leverage to encourage people to play nice by threatening to cut off their bennies if they cause a mess. If the Hutts can stoke enough special hatred, the economic incentives will be overwhelmed. It worked less well against the Empire, which is perfectly happy to provide the brute force themselves, and left 2 Star Destroyers parked above Sri Lur at all times, presumably one to keep an eye on the Weak Way and one to keep an eye on the Hook. The Nikto didn't have a significant population on the planet, they raided from across the border in Hutt space, so both Star Destroyers would just blast any Nikto they saw on sight, and that had the Nikto angle covered. The Empire was ultimately pretty stupid and dysfunctional, but there is something satisfying about watching Hutt influence grow through the cracks of the intricate economic incentive structures the Republic built like meticulous clockwork, and then the Empire just dropped a brick on all of it.